Joel Thomason, 31, of Denair, had set out to go on a hike on September 6th from the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir all the way out to Lake Eleanor, which is roughly about a 9-mile, or for those of you that are not in the States, 14 kilometers away, and he had originally planned to return to the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir by September 9th, which was only about 3 days. It was then that he was declared missing on that Saturday, and immediately, Yosemite National Park officials had released a statement declaring these things as well as his general description. He was seen as being about 5 feet 10 inches, had a buzz-cut brown hair, and last carrying a yellow and gray backpack, a green sleeping bag, a blue and green hammock, and a red inflatable kayak. They deeply urged anybody who has been in the area of Miguel Meadow, Lake Eleanor, or the trails surrounding the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir to alert authorities if they know of his whereabouts. Because once the search ensued, Yosemite Search and Rescue were able to find no trace of him at all. In fact, Amanda Thomason, his wife, had made a Facebook post on a Sunday right after he was declared missing that at least 16 National Park Service search and rescue crew members, along with their dogs, were looking for her lost husband. In fact, the entire county of Tuolumne even joined in on the search and rescue mission in search of him, also bringing along equipment and helicopters and kayaks and boat to try and get the general perimeter of where he was last seen in hopes they would find some trace of him. But, unfortunately, to this day in 2022, there's still no trace of Joel Thomason. Is it possible that, like many of the other missing hikers who disappear in all the national parks, he was potentially snatched up, killed, or taken by something? Could he have perhaps fallen into a crevice or fell off a cliff? That could very well be likely, but don't you think with all of these experienced search personnel and outdoor caravans searching for him, they would at least find a trace of him? It doesn't make sense that so many of these hikers just seem to disappear without a trace. And the trail he was taking from the Hetch Hetchy to Lake Eleanor isn't exactly off the beaten path. In fact, the entire trail system within Yosemite National Park is all well traversed, with people around and people coming and going, so it's not like he had just wandered off by himself into the deep woods completely without any idea of where he was going, which makes his disappearance all the more strange, like the many thousands of others who are just like him, who disappear without a single trace. I would love to know what you guys think. In fact, Timothy John Barnes, who's only 25 years old, is a lot like Joel Thomason in the sense where he just disappeared. Timothy John Barnes had been a resident of Cucamonga, California in 1988. Timothy had left Tenaya Lakes, right near Highway 120 East, to Tioga Road in California. This was approximately at 9 in the morning. On July 5th, 1988, Timothy had this plan to hike from the Murphy Creek trailhead all the way to Polydome Lakes in Yosemite National Park. The location is approximately 3 miles, give or take, from Tenaya Lakes. But, like many other hikers who promised they'll be back, he never showed up and was never seen from again. Now, if we look specifically at these kinds of disappearances, it's very possible that there is a human trafficking element, which I'm 100% sure does happen. But how do you account for the hundreds, if not thousands, of people that go reporting under strange circumstances like this? I mean, these people don't just disappear, they literally disappear without a trace of anybody ever seeing them again. And if we think critically, to smuggle someone or to kidnap them, you would have to do it very clandestinely, without anybody else, including other hikers, campers, or park personnel, seeing you at all. And a lot of times, these people go missing off in the middle of nowhere, albeit they're still on a well-known trail, but still, it just seems highly unlikely. Timothy's friends at the time had reported him missing to the park ranger personnel and the search and rescue service, and they began an extensive search the following day. But even that failed to produce any evidence to his potential whereabouts. And finally, on July 19th, 1992, he was legally declared dead after years of his disappearance, and his remains have never been found. And 30 years later, since his declaration of death, well, almost about 30 years, there has still been no trace of him ever to be found. And his family, like many other of the missing persons, will never have that closure, at least for the time being. This next story was submitted to me by an anonymous park ranger who wanted to be referred to as Steven. At this time that it happened, he was doing his nightly rounds in 2011, and he patrolled the Yosemite Valley. And at this time, it was roughly 11:10 p.m., And he remembers this vividly because of the image on the dashboard sticking out in his mind. Currently at the time, he was on a road called Northside Drive when he noticed what appeared to be a man or figure moving off the field to his right-hand side. Thinking that it was a potential hiker or camper who needed help, who was maybe trying to wave his truck down, he pulls over to get a better look, and as he did, he sees that this figure actually stands up. And when it stood up, Stephen was horrified by what he saw, because this wasn't just a person coming towards his truck. It wasn't a Bigfoot, but the person didn't have any definition. Usually, if it was a hiker or somebody in need, you could clearly see from the distance he was at, which was maybe 30 yards at most. You could see clothing, you could see facial hair or hair, depending on the lighting conditions, but Stephen didn't see any of those things. In fact, he would describe it as just a black shadow, but clearly a person in shape, or at least a human being. And as he looked and began to squint and study what he was looking at, because the moonlight only provided so much illumination, he said that this figure began to slowly levitate and almost glide in the air towards his direction. Stephen, in complete shock, holding his wheel, not sure how to react or what to do or say, watched as this figure glided about 25 feet and then just seemed to dissipate into nothing. Stephen had no idea how to comprehend what he was even looking at. I mean, he was still confused and just puzzled by what he had just seen. Afterwards, he was rubbing his eyes and thinking to himself, did that really happen? Did I hallucinate? Am I sleep deprived? So he quickly goes back to the ranger station, gets himself a cup of coffee because he's thinking he's just out of his mind at this point. Doesn't tell anybody for a while. Now, what's very interesting with Stephen is he wrote that the following morning he had spoken to a couple of hikers and tourists in that general area, and they were asking him about a mysterious black figure that was scaring people. In fact, one of the men who had spoken to Stephen was an older gentleman, and he had told him that this person had spooked him and his wife all night because it was trying to peer into their camper's windows and trying to rattle and open the door. But every time they looked, they would just see this dark figure moving around their RV. And they all gave him the same description. Nobody said anything about it being a Bigfoot or anything like that, but they just saw it as a dark figure, but couldn't really make out any features or details, which they just assumed because of the lack of light. Another woman, a mother of 3 whom Stephen spoke to, described a very similar scenario. Her and her kids were up late roasting marshmallows over the fire when one of her boys had pointed out over towards the woodline and saw this person standing there by the tree watching them. But she described in horror as this figure or person had red glowing eyes, but was just the shape of a man, but black, all black like a shadow. And she described to Stephen that she felt pure evil coming from this person or thing or whatever it was, and immediately got the boys in the tent and had pulled out her firearm ready in case anything happened. Although nothing did happen. After Stephen had corroborated the details between this older gentleman and this mom of 3, the time that this happened was about an hour or 2 before his own sighting in that general area, which means it's very possible that Stephen did in fact see the same shadow person that these people did. It's unknown at the time if anybody else in the general area saw the same thing. These are the only 2 witnesses that Stephen had corroborated with. After he had time to process this sighting, he never really did bother telling anybody else about it and still struggles to talk about it now for the fear that somebody will think he's crazy, which is part of the reason he did not want me to personally use his name and asked that I use the name Stephen. So what do you guys think of this case? Is it mere coincidence that 3 different people, including a park ranger, saw the same thing? Or is there truly a black apparition or shadow person that was wandering through Yosemite National Park that evening?